numbers because they're pretty entertaining. So here is the deck overall. This was the day before I posted about Crusher Silent Priest and wrote my guide, and we all sort of discussed it. Before that, the win rate was at about 60%, which is, yeah, that's what I was doing. I assume all of these games are just me, because I think I was the only one running this exact list that day, probably. And then once I posted it, the win rate dropped all the way down to 44%, which is not very good. But what's cool is we get to see some stats about like how it does against different classes, and in particular individual cards. So as was my experience, it does very well against Hunter and Demon Hunter, and I primarily relied on that to do well on ladder. Its poor matchups are apparently Mage. Little surprised, but not too surprised. I mean, all the removal they have is really good, but I thought that maybe silencing the freeze effects away would make a big difference. Priest is bad, yeah, I believe that. Rogue is bad. I was going like 50-50 against Rogue, but it did feel like I was getting a little lucky, so not too surprised. And then Shaman and Warrior, some of the better ones, I agree with that. Warlock's bad, yeah. These all sort of mostly agreed with my experience, but I was doing a little bit better. Alright, now the interesting part is like which cards are good. So, or actually probably more importantly, which cards are bad. So the card that was actually the worst in the deck based on win rate is Smite, and it's pretty bad. So I think the first step to trying to improve this deck is to remove the Smites. So I've taken them out and replaced them with things that I hope are better. On the other hand, one that we find is actually one of the better cards is Renew. That's like the third strongest card in the deck, and I was only running one of that, so I'm going to add another one of those. And then another card that seemed to be doing poorly was Shadow Word Death. Another thing that's sort of surprising to me is that like Apotheosis is so bad. I guess I considered trying to remove that, but I really feel like that was winning me a lot of games. Now these aren't my numbers, these are like the numbers of people in general, so maybe they're not quite playing Apotheosis the time that I would, but I don't know, maybe I'm mistaken and Apotheosis just really isn't that strong of a card. So the cards that are doing well, there's sort of a pattern that it's high-end duplication stuff, makes sense. Getting some solid early game minions like Imprisoned Homunculus and Watcher, Ancient Watcher. I'm trying to think if there's any other things. Faceless Rager is very strong. So yeah, all the duplication stuff is pretty good. So how do we make it better? Well, so a lot of the comments on Reddit were that it runs out of cards quickly. That is the drawback to this deck. But it's good for us to try to mitigate it. So I would say that we were leaning into the strength of the deck's early game, which I think is good, but it is possibly reasonable to try to mitigate it a little bit more. And we have sort of two options to go about that. We can either add some higher end minions, or we can add some card draw, but there's not really good card draw in Priest, so maybe card generation. So the two builds I was considering are basically the same build here, except remove the Shadow Word Death and Holy Smite, add another Renew, and then either add two high-end minions. In this case, I'm trying out Mortuary Machine and Soldier of Fortune, or add two Thought Steals. Thought Steal is like a very mana-efficient card, but it's a bit... well, it's random. You get cards from their deck. The cards from their deck are not necessarily the kind of things that are actually going to help you win. So I'm not a huge fan of it, but there's really just not that many other options as far as card generation or card draw go.